welcome to Lark Distillery. I'm Matt Bailey, your National Ambassador for the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, and I'm very lucky to be sitting here today with Jonnie Edwards, distiller from Lark Distillery today, we're going to ask some questions. We've got some of your questions, and we're sitting in the Bond store at Lark Distillery today, which is just awesome. The smell of being in a Bond store always reminds me of being at a distillery. Just that awesome smell of the wood and the spirit and mature spirit and new make. Do you ever get sick of that?
Never actually. Absolutely not.
You still get every time you walk in here, you still get that same sort of that smell and that feel of everything. We're sitting in front of a sherry butt right now as our table.
It's not just the Bond store though. We have 3 days off in a row because we do long days. So
yep.
You come in on that first day back and just open up the door into the distillery and you're like, that's fantastic. It's just all those smells wafting. You got spirit, whiskey, fermentations kicking through.
The smell of the ferments in the distillery just next door it's really what gets me going. I met up with Jonnie just yesterday. Was that yesterday?
Yeah.
It's been a long couple of days, and the first thing I said was, he said, try the spirit, and I said, that's great. And then he said, you've got to taste the ferment. I was like, oh yes. I don't know, for me that really sort of like bubbling sort of wash sort of taste in the beer taste is just that, it's really quite invigorating. It's almost like the benchmark for the spirit to be, in a way.
Absolutely. And I think especially our peated runs when we do that fermentation, they just taste like bigger Laphroaig sours by the end of their run, quite acidic, but just that smoky characteristic that comes through is fantastic.
Awesome. How long have you been with Lark, and what's your role in Tail?
So started with Lark pretty much 4.5 years ago. They just needed someone to pour some drinks at the Taste of Tassie, believe it or not. And fortunately enough, I had my RSA. I'd only been back in Tassie for just a couple of months at the time.
Where were you coming from?
So I'd been travelling for a fair bit of time. I actually just flew back from Europe. I was over there for a few months. And before that I was in Southeast Asia and living in the Northern Territory doing forestry.
Right, okay.
So
a background in wood and wood management, if you like,
Exactly. So, funnily enough, it was actually nice to come into an industry where timber's still a bit of a focus as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, cellar door for about 18 months, and then finally worked my way up to production after really just fell in love with whiskey. I think everyone, the romanticism behind it all, just keeps you going, and just want really to get involved in the production side of things.
I'm not the only person to have said this, I'm sure, but I always feel like you're like the embodiment of Lark. You've got such a passion for the brand. In fact, it was one of your co-workers who told me that you were short of I think it was a Lark hoodie, and you wanted to take it to Europe with you to make sure you had a fresh Lark hoodie to take to Europe.
Absolutely. Always got to represent the brand.
Yeah, exactly. Always on brand. Even I'm wearing my Society t-shirt right now, exactly. And where did you pick up, how did you learn how to distill, and how did you learn where all that, was that just something that sort of evolved through Chris and Craig here over the years, or was this just...
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's obviously suggesting Chris. Chris has been here for 13 years now.
Yep.
And when we had Craig on board...
He's the head distiller, for those watching.
I think between those two, they complement each other. They complement each other so well. Their palates, their understanding of distillation, and understanding of Lark's distillation, that was probably the biggest thing for me. So for me, having those two to actually go off and always go back to all the things you learnt from them over time. And I'm still learning from Chris this very day. There's so much that you get through. Such a repetition thing. So the more you do it, I don't think I was fully comfortable with actually making or getting my own cuts perfectly right until about 12 months in. And you've been doing your own cuts for a good 9 months at that stage, but it just takes a while to really understand the complexities of that spirit when it comes out of the still.
Yeah, right. Something I always experience when I go to a distillery for the first time and then come back even years later will be seeing how much has changed, but how much stays the same at the same time. In your time here, what do you see as some things that have where the traditional methods are still being used, or where there's still sort of some things have changed and some things haven't? What would be that from your perspective as an insider here?
I think the one thing that we really honed down on is getting that house style right with our new make spirit.
Yep.
And we'll still probably having a less consistency with what we're actually taking for volume of low wines or volume of falls and faints, and then brew with a little bit probably not consistent with between the 4 distillers that we had on at the time as well. So we've really nailed down and fine tuned our recipe that we have for Lark, and we're able to create a new make spirit, a great new make spirit on a consistent basis now, which is really good.
And obviously diversity of wood and diversity of casks. Even in one of the many bond stores that we're sitting in right now. Has that widened, do you think, over the years, or do you think there's a bit more even experimentation in other types of wood and other types of finishes and whatnot?
Definitely. I think Lark's always been renowned for having that massive port cask coming through. Done quite a few sherries and a few bourbons back in the day. We'll definitely put probably a few more bourbons down now. Those port casks, we could talk about, speaking about palate and house style, quite middle of the palate, the back end of the palate too. So those American oak bourbon casks give us some tropical notes and fun enough to play out now that we're making marriages for both our classic cask and cask strength, which has put us on the right path for better balanced whiskies.
I just tasted a whiskey that I'm not even sure I'm allowed to mention, but I just tasted a Lark just yesterday, courtesy of Jonnie. That my remark instantly was that it's probably the most integrated whiskey I think Lark has ever made, and I mean that in the most complimentary way, because it had everything sitting right in the middle, like where it should. Like I always say at my tastings that often the best whiskey isn't so much one that meets a certain age statement or anything like that. It's where the spirit and the oak meet right in the middle, and there's a distillery character and there's a wood influence right in the middle, rather than being over oaked or overly spirit driven. But yeah, that for me was that example.
Definitely.
Yeah.
That was the Wolf of the Willows.
Okay, Wolf of the So Wolf of the Willows. I didn't even know I was allowed to say anything, but that's the second release of Wolf and the Willows coming.
Yeah.
Want to tell us a little bit about that? We'll walk past that in a little bit.
Yeah. So the Wolf of the Willows was a bit of we wanted to take collaboration with the brewery to the next step.
Yep.
And the original premise was behind it was we send them a couple of casks over, essentially 4 casks, and they were going to mature a smoked imperial porter in it, and then they were going to send 2 of those casks back to us, and we're going to put a whiskey in it to finish off. So that one came about. We had Wolf of the Willows, the first release about 9 months ago, and for this time round we wanted to aim for a winter release this time round, so they could have the beer and the whiskey side by side. It's that stout and porter season, especially the barrel aged beer season.
Yep.
So being able to have that one and the whiskey. So the whiskey is coming out mid-July, which is really cool.
Mid-July. Keep an eye out for that one. We're going to try something now, and whilst we're tasting this, and you tell us what it is, I'm going to get some questions from some of our members and some people on Twitter, and even a state manager who asked a question, and some questions off Facebook and Twitter, which I only just tweeted this an hour ago, so I do apologise. Probably should have tweeted that yesterday. All right, so I'm having a chat with Jonnie today. Any questions I can throw out? So Drew from Canberra asks, what is happening in the Australian whisky industry to better unite and tackle our ridiculous excise charges? Matthias Corman likes a good dram.
I'm glad to hear that, actually. I think it's always a good dram. Look, I think at the end of the day, we think about it in terms of volume. Well, volume's going to be the one thing that really makes a difference on this. All the Australian distilleries combined right now wouldn't even produce enough new make spirit to rival the biggest distillery in Scotland, just the one distillery in Scotland. So I think growth within the industry, and once these whiskies start coming of age, obviously a lot more distilleries coming through, and having a lot more volume, I think that's really going to push the, definitely in Parliament at some stage to start looking at that over time.
What Jonnie's literally just drawn this straight from the cask, just over behind us, which is literally a barrel sample of something. What is it?
It's definitely whiskey. So this particular dram it's actually a finishing cask. The particular whiskies, from memory, it was 3 or 4 different barrels that went into this. They're all second fills. One was a rum cask, a rum cask finish again. A second fill sherry and a second fill port, and a bit of a peated cask in there as well.
I was about to say there is definitely a peat influence in there, but it's very, very subtle.
So this has been sitting in a 200 litre bourbon for about 18 months. The whiskey itself is just under 7 years old, but I hadn't tried this whiskey for a long period of time, probably about 6 months. So it's nice to be able to just have a look at it and actually see how it's growing on the way through.
It's got to be like crushed candy and a bit of rum and raisin in there. That's just
it's delightful. It's really quite balanced actually.
Rum and raisin ice cream. Lovely.
Still quite spirit driven, but I love the fact that American oak and that bourbon's actually pulling all these second fills together now, and there's a nice bit of oaken fills.
Quite high proof. I think
it's about 66 from memory.
It's coming across very, very Another question from Drew as well was, what's some of your favourite food and whiskey combinations? Personally, if you're having some food and you're having some whiskey together at home or at a bar or anywhere, what would be some of your favourite combinations?
Savoury side of things, like I'm always a stickler for a good smoked brisket.
Awesome.
And I think classic Ardbeg. Just anything Ardbeg goes so well with that. And then cheese. Like just any type of cheese. And I always find having some fortified cask finishes with cheese, that fruity and sweetness it kicks through with the savouriness from the cheese works really well.
Yeah, awesome. Okay. Jude asks, why is it so hard to find Aussie whiskies that aren't just massive sherry bombs, or I'm assuming sherry and port casks, like wine casks and fortified casks? Bourbon casks in Australia are so rare, only a couple of distilleries do them. Can you explain why bourbon casks are so much infrequently used in Australian whiskey?
That's actually a great question because I've got my own little opinion and theory on this one.
Sure.
So I got my own theory on this one. Sorry for the question from Jude. Hey Jude. So at the end of the day, the whiskey industry has been built off from the early days of especially Lark itself, big fortified casks, and people that are drinking these casks are probably drinking whiskey for the first time as well. So my first introduction into whiskey was actually an Overeem sherry cask and an Overeem port cask. So my first understanding of whiskey was that big port and sherry influence. I moved on to Scotch after a little while. But you try to replicate those flavours you see in the Aussie whiskey, which is the Glendronachs, the Macallans, as you do. Now, my understanding behind this is when you start to get into a wine or a whiskey, you look for the big flavours coming through. And for me, the understanding of whiskey coming through, I'm just trying to get this one right. So those big port flavours, when you first start drinking it, it doesn't remind you of actually drinking whiskey. So the whiskey that you normally drunk, with Coke back in the day, that tastes like whiskey.
Yep.
This is quite different. It's quite polarising. Like, wow, I can really enjoy whiskey now. I think after a couple of years, you start to wean yourself off those big sherry and port bombs and move on to the bourbon. But right now, we're at a stage where people are really introduced to Aussie whiskey for the first time. And I see it like the McLaren Vale, the Barossa Shiraz. It's such a big wine. And everyone loves the big Shiraz. I think it's Aussie palate for the same number of things as well as it goes through.
We've got a couple of quick fire ones before we have to move on. What do you drink at home?
To be honest, at the moment, sour beers.
Sour beers.
Massive fan.
I can get around that. What's the craziest idea that you haven't done yet at Lark?
Look, I'd always love to get some peated malt from Port Ellen and run them through our stills.
That would be amazing, using Scottish peat, Isla peat even, or Scottish peat in Tassie whiskey production. I think it would be quite unique. And one cheeky one from Jimmy Martin that got the most attention. What will Lark's SMWS code be?
Well, that's probably a question for you more than for myself, I think, Matt.
We were joking before. He said, why don't I just say something like GN3? Stay tuned. I've said that before. Let's have a walk around the distillery.
Yeah. Okay.
Awesome. Cool.